One of the challenges to building a data center is finding the energy to power it. Even without new data centers, many electricity grids are struggling to meet demand. This means tech companies and data center builders are thinking about, or being required to, find power for themselves. In this video, I'll take a look at 3 options for powering data centers: natural gas, solar, and wind. Using a simple tool I've developed, I'll walk through the costs of these 3 options for building a data center in different parts of the world. Yes, this is a little bit different than my usual videos on training or inferencing LLMs, but relevant to language models nonetheless. I'm going to go through the different options here for powering data centers, all based on a tool that you can try out at gigawattdatacenter.com. You can follow the link here. It's a Gradio website that I've built, and it allows you, I'll walk through in detail, it allows you to test all sorts of scenarios for different locations. You can start by typing in your location here and clicking Analyze, and it will run analysis on different cases: solar with gas, wind, hybrid, that's wind and solar, and then closed cycle, combined cycle gas turbine. So you've got 4 different scenarios that will be run there, and a panel of settings that we will go through during the presentation. Now, the sections I've broken this down into are first, a quick review of these technology options among some other options you might look at for building a data center. A quick comment on the demand that you expect to see from a data center and how that compares to the demand you would see from households or a typical electricity grid. And then I'll do some scenario modeling. So I'll talk through some of the key factors in modeling a gas-powered plant, a solar plant, a wind plant, and then a solar plus wind combination. Now, all of these here will have a little bit of gas because we'll find that is pretty crucial to making the economics work. Then I'll give a summary and some thoughts on the path forward for how these options might develop and what the best options are right now for those who are building data centers. I've kept the list of potential technologies quite short, and I hope towards the ones that are most practical. If somebody came to me and said, I want to build a gigawatt or even 100 megawatt, which is probably the size we're at now, data center, probably you would be thinking about diesel because it's very flexible. Of course, diesel has the challenge not just of CO2 emissions, but particulate emissions as well. So where possible, plants will want to avoid using diesel. So I'm going to instead consider the option of natural gas. One of the key challenges with natural gas, if you're building your own power supply, is that you're going to need a gas connection. So that can be a hurdle if you can't secure a pathway for the gas, or indeed storage for liquid natural gas. And CO2 emissions are a problem there too. In terms of solar and wind, some of the key challenges there are permitting and environmental review, and also getting access to sufficient land, because 1 gigawatt of power is a lot of power that's going to require a lot of land for either solar or for wind. I'm not going to talk about nuclear. I think if you want to build a gigawatt data center, you're probably not planning to do it via nuclear if you've a plan to do something quite soon. So the options I'll look at are just going to be natural gas, solar, and wind. I'll look at them individually, and then I'll look at them in different combinations. Now, just a high-level comment around data centers. A data center is a very expensive piece of capital equipment, especially if you're putting in expensive GPUs and even CPUs to a smaller degree. And this makes it quite uneconomic to turn them off in the same way that we might turn off devices at home during the night when we're not using them. And so when designing for a data center, we're looking more towards having high uptime or being able to supply much more continuous power and not really being able to just turn it off because the sun goes down or the wind goes down. And to understand this a bit better, you can think about the cost of an NVIDIA H100. This is one of the top GPUs. I guess there's Blackwell now. But if you look at one GPU for 30K price, and the PCI version would be 300 watts of power, you're spending 100K per kilowatt installed. And the cost of power, let's say you do gas, now maybe you do wind or solar, but the cost of gas is going to be roughly maybe 1,000 per kilowatt. And so you are never going to want to turn off your GPU. You're just instead going to want to build more capacity. That capacity could be solar, it could be wind, it could be gas, but the economic incentives are such because the GPUs are so expensive, you're going to want to keep the uptime high. Probably the training runs you're doing or even the inference runs are going to be very valuable, and it will just be worth paying for more capital equipment to be able to power them reliably on an as-needs basis, as opposed to just turning them off on a demand basis. And This is important for me to state up front because it motivates how I'll design all of these options going forward. It means I'm going to design to be able to provide a steady 1 gigawatt of power. I'm not going to allow, say, that power to go down. It always needs to be available for the data center to take. So back to our overview, and we'll start off with the simplest model I have, which is for a gas power plant. And we'll see here the main difference in gas power plants is the cost of the gas itself, which is a significant difference between the US and Europe, for example. Now, my goal here through all the models is not to do something that's very complicated. It's to try and give you the large levers that allow you to design your own plant for the part of the world that you are in. And so that's kind of the framework I'm coming to this with. For the gas modeling plant, we're going to look at what's called a combined cycle gas power plant, which is maybe 55 to 66 to 60% efficient. So this is a high efficiency gas power plant, as opposed to a low efficiency one, which we would use for peaking to support other forms of power, often solar or wind, for example, or even grid stability. So yeah, we use a combined cycle gas power plant. I'm assuming a 70% capacity factor. You can vary that on the website. This means if you take 70%, it's going to be built to 1.43 gigawatts in order to provide 1 gigawatt of reliable power. The cost of this is $1,200 per kilowatt. So that would be $1.2 billion per gigawatt of rated capacity on an installed basis. And last of all, I've assumed a maintenance cost here, which you can also update in the dashboard. So for our first example, let me just go across to the settings. Right at the bottom, I have the gas settings. If I scroll up a little bit, actually. And here I have CCGT, the combined cycle gas turbine efficiency. It's at 55. The CapEx is $1,200 per kilowatt. Solar and wind will be lower, but they have more intermittent operation. We'll come to that later. The operating expense is 1 cent per kilowatt hour, and my capacity factor is 0.7. So it's just as I've said. Just a note for those interested in the assumptions around financing, I'm assuming a life of 20 years. I'll do that for all of the equipment, solar and wind. I'm assuming 60% debt financing and a tax rate of 21%. And for the debt rate, I'm putting it 2% above the 20-year US bond, and the equity premium, I'm putting it 5% above the 20-year bond. So you can play around with these factors to influence the weighted cost of capital, which, by the way, for these factors is roughly, I think, 6.6%, so just under 7%. You could adjust that if you wanted. It will affect the levelized cost of energy. Okay, so I've set the parameters here for gas, and I'm going to run an analysis. Now, we can just run it here for Waterford in Ireland. The location doesn't affect the gas. What does affect it is the price of gas in terms of MMB. So if we look here, MMBTU, this is the dollars per MMBTU in Europe. Right now, it's probably around 12. So if I run this analysis here, and we should see it appear here in the combined cycle, we've got a levelized cost of power of about 10 cents. The capacity is 1.43 because we're overbuilding, as I said. The CapEx is $1,700 per kilowatt, 1.7 billion in total. And here's the weighted cost of capital, 6.4. And you can see if we look at the breakdown of the costs, most of the cost going towards combined cycle power generation is going towards the fuel. And that, of course, is not present if you look at a pure solar or at a pure wind, which we'll get to later on. So here we have a European scenario. The price you can see coming in at about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. If we wanted, we could change that price of natural gas from 12 down to the price at Henry Hub, which is actually around 2, or maybe you could put it a little higher at 3 and rerun the analysis. And we can check now what the representative price would be for the US. So here we have about 4 to 5 cents. So there's a very large difference between gas prices in the US and Europe. And in principle, this drives a large difference in the price of power that would come from a gas turbine. Okay, so that was our first example here. And it's the simplest one. It's a straightforward single gas power plant that you can think of as a baseline. And with that, we're going to be able to have a baseline to compare the solar and the wind. So to move to solar, we're going to start with the simplest possible configuration and have nothing else, just solar panels. And first off, this wouldn't even be possible because the sun, of course, only shines during the day. And as we've said, you need to have power available for high expense data centers. And so therefore you need at least to have some kind of battery storage if you're going to rely on solar only. So in order to satisfy this roughly constant power demand of 1 gigawatt, I'm going to say we need 24 hours worth of batteries. Now you could debate, maybe you need a little bit more, a little bit less, depend on intraday patterns, but this will allow me to make some assumptions going forward on what this plant will cost. So we've got 24 hours worth of energy storage coupled with the solar panels. And now some assumptions for costing these panels. So if we have panels at $550 per kilowatt and 24 hours of storage at $250 per kilowatt, we've 20% panel efficiency. And then just for the sake of calculating how much area these solar panels will take, I'm assuming 2.5 square meters of land per square meter of solar panels themselves. I'm modeling this as a single axis PV module, and I'm using 2020 hourly data. So I'm actually looking at the hourly data for whatever location you put in order to compute the solar output that these panels are going to give. Now, the reference for these costs here is taken from a piece by Austin Vernon. He inspired me actually to build this because he did some calculations around a solar PV data center configuration. And you'll see if you go down here to the section on costs, we can find his assumptions around batteries and around solar. He actually recommends $1,000 per kilowatt AC, so quite a bit above $550 and maybe $350 for batteries. But then he goes on to say that potentially if you factor out things like maybe taxes, which are higher in the US on solar panels, and savings if your data center is just operating in DC and you don't need to convert up to AC, he's suggesting that maybe you can get down to about $550. Sorry, I'll increase my screen size. Maybe $550 here for solar and $250 here for the batteries. So I'm going with those more aggressive estimates here for solar and batteries. Now, to understand the power that we will get from this set of PVs, we need the hourly data. I already mentioned that. Here, for example, is the hourly data for Tucson, Arizona, which is a very sunny place in the US. And this is, you can't actually see the y-axis, but it's the days across the year. Can I just, no, it actually doesn't seem to be there. And yeah, you can get a distribution of summertime here. And then as you move out away from summer, you're getting low levels of sun. But because this is relatively close to the equator, there's not too much of a difference between the sun and the winter months, which we'll see later is pretty significant in terms of helping us to keep down the size of the solar array that we will need. Now, in terms of modeling, what I do is I take all of these days of sun, and the reason I can treat them as days is because I have 24 hours of battery storage. So that's the key here. And now I'm going to reorganize them in ascending order to get this graph here. So this is the same data. You can see the axis goes up to 10 as well. I actually have day of the year on this one, which is good. And you can see the shape of this curve. So yeah, we have many days with a lot of sun, and there's only really very few days in Tucson where there's quite a low level of sun. And if we want to build a plant that is only using solar and 24 hours of batteries, we need to size our plant so that on the worst day, which is this one here, we need to be able to provide a gigawatt. So that's the criterion. This might strike you as quite a strict design criterion. It is, and we're going to improve on this. But as a baseline, we're going to design the plant based on the worst day of the year here and see how much that costs. So let's head over to the modeling. And I'm going to go to the solar panel parameters. You can see my solar cost is $550. Let's see if I can increase my font size just a little. The solar panel efficiency, density, that's 1/2.5, which I talked about. And then the 24 hours of storage. And there's one parameter I need to change here, which is whether or not we're going to allow gas to be used. Just scrolling down here now, I need to change the cutoff. So I'll just search for cutoff. And yeah, I've set that down to 0. Which means that natural gas is not going to be used at all to support the system on any day. I'm going to keep the price of natural gas at $3 per MMBTU and just make sure that my location here is Tucson, Arizona. And now I can run this analysis. And what this should show when we go to the solar analysis results is the LCOE, the levelized cost, which is 19 cents, which is really not bad considering this is just batteries and solar and we have no form of gas that is helping us out. You'll notice, however, that we're really overbuilding the system. So for every gigawatt of rated capacity, we're building 21 gigawatts of solar power, which is going to cover the area equivalent to 0.3% of Ireland. The capex per kilowatt is going to be really high because we're sizing it for the lowest day of sun around the year. And this is the plot here. So you can see we're sizing according to this lowest day of capacity of the year, which means we're very oversized for the rest of the year. And when we look at the capital expenditure, there's no spending on gas. Most of our spending here is on solar panels. And then we have significant spending as well on the 24 hours worth of batteries. And so that was the scenario where we use no gas at all. And in Tucson, it's not too bad. Oh, wrong spelling here for Tucson. We have 19 cents per kilowatt hour, which is pretty impressive, although it's a very overbuilt system. If you look at doing it in Dublin or Waterford or somewhere, you'll get a ridiculous price because you have to build literally probably 40, 50 times the capacity that you need on the worst day of the year. But we can improve a lot on this just by using a little bit of gas in the whole system. And the reason is, if we look at our initial design based on the worst day of the year, if we allow ourselves gas on the 50 worst days of the year, we're able to design based on this point here. And you can see just how much of an improvement that is, being able to size the system based on this generation capacity here, which is about 10 times the generation capacity on the worst day. So this will allow us to build a much smaller solar array or do a lot less overbuilding. And specifically how that's done is by adding an open cycle gas power plant. Now we add open cycle, you could add closed cycle, but you add open cycle often because it's cheaper. So it would be about $800 per kilowatt of installed capacity instead of $1,200 for the combined cycle. And the combined cycle, on the other hand, gives you higher efficiency. So typically, if you're going to use the gas plant a lot, you want to buy an expensive one that's efficient. If you're not going to use a lot, you're going to buy the open cycle one, which is a bit cheaper. Although the maintenance cost can also be higher if you buy the cheaper one too. So we're going to use 1 gigawatt of gas capacity, and then you're going to see that we'll still overbuild the solar, but we'll overbuild it by much less, and that will allow us to get to a significantly cheaper plant. So let me head over and make those changes. In the cutoff, so I'll search for cutoff, I'm going to set this up to 50 days. And what else do I need to change? I'll take a look at the open cycle gas turbine numbers. So we've got the capex is $800 per kilowatt, the opex is 2 cents per kilowatt, and the efficiency of the open cycle is 30%, instead of 55%. So with that, we can run for Tucson and take a look at the solar analysis results coming up here. And we should see that this, it reduces our costs significantly. We're down now to just under 10 cents, about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. You'll notice that we really need to use very little gas. Only 3% of the energy consumed is going to be gas. The solar capacity factor, so that's the amount of energy consumed from solar divided by its nameplate capacity if it was running fully throughout the year at max sun. You can see that we do curtail the sun, so there's a lot of solar power being produced that is just going to be thrown away. We're only going to use about 1/3 of it, but this is still going to be somewhat optimal if we want to operate with such a low amount of gas. So here you can see how that gas fills in. Basically on the 50 low days, it's filling in here for the solar. And on all of these days, we've excess solar, but the excess solar is much, much less than what it was before when we didn't have any gas to help us out. Of course, now we have some capex added in for the gas plant. But overall, this has allowed us to greatly reduce the size of our solar array. In fact, to the extent that batteries are now the leading capex cost if we hold constant, needing 24 hours of batteries. So that's an example of how solar can be reduced significantly in cost just by adding in a small amount of gas. And it works particularly well in a location like Tucson, again spelled miscorrectly, where we have sun that is going to be not so different between the winter and the summer. If you run the same simulation for Dublin, you're going to be able to reduce the cost a lot. So we were at like $2 something, and now it's down to 28 cents. So this is a lot higher than what the cost would be in Arizona, because we've not just less sun in Dublin, but the graph is also less favorable in how it looks. In fact, if you look at the plot for sun here in Dublin, even if we move to building based on the 50th day here, there's a very large difference between the 50th worst day in Dublin and the median day. So that's a very big difference, whereas in Tucson, once you get up to the 50th day, it's actually not far off the median sunshine, so you don't end up overbuilding. And I think this is a point that's maybe not so obvious. When you're near the equator, yes, you get better sun, but also the summer-winter difference is very small. It's big, but it's relatively small compared to what we get in Ireland or further north. You have very large differences between the sun and in the summer and in the winter, and this forces you to overbuild. It's actually a problem too in wind. The wind is going to be very different seasonally, and that also forces you to overbuild your wind capacity a lot if you're trying to get the gas production down. So we've added in gas. We've shown how that can reduce even by just allowing for 3% or 6% in Dublin. That's the 50 worst days using gas. We can run an example as well where we allow gas to be used on the 183 worst days. So basically on half of the year, we're allowing gas to be used. And if we run that simulation, actually in Tucson, the price is very similar, which shows you that actually using solar and batteries is fairly close to optimal if you're in Tucson and can be competitive with using natural gas. Now in Dublin, well, on the other hand, if you decide to run with the worst half of the year using gas, that means you'll use 26% gas. So you're using substantially more gas now, although still way less than what is being used. I think actually in Ireland, we currently use about 50% wind. So, gas is maybe not all that far off 26%, but we have other forms of fossil fuel too. And the key point here is that we are saving significantly by allowing more gas to be used. So if you decide you're going to use only a small amount of gas in Dublin or anywhere in Ireland, it's going to lead to significantly higher electricity prices. And that brings us to the recap of solar. So a few bullet points. Solar and battery work really well at the equator. Once you get further from the equator, there's less total sun, but there's also higher variance between winter and summer sun, which forces you to either massively overbuild or to use more gas to keep a reasonable price of delivered power. Next up in the scenario modeling then is wind generation. And you'll see a lot of my analysis mirrors what I did for solar. So we'll start again with wind power only, and we'll try and satisfy this demand of 1 gigawatt. This time we're going to loosen up the battery requirement a little bit because wind generally is blowing more consistently than sun. So the sun is down during the night time and wind is a bit better than that. It's not, the wind is not up for roughly 1/3 of the day. It's often closer to maybe 40%, or offshore it could be even above 50%. So in principle, you might be able to reduce your batteries. Now there's something I'm not covering in this analysis, which is that you can have periods of no wind for maybe a week or a few weeks, or even a few days in a row. And for that to be able to cover it, you might need some short to medium term storage, which I'm not analyzing here. I'm just keeping things simple by focusing on batteries and the wind. So in the no gas case for wind, I'm assuming onshore turbines, 7.5 gigawatts at $1,300 per kilowatt, and 12 hours of batteries at the same price, $250 per kilowatt hour, as I used for this, the solar case. And for the modeling, I'm assuming an E126 7.5 megawatt onshore turbine, 135 meters hub height, and I collect wind data for whatever location you specify at 100 meters height, which is fairly close to the hub height for that given location, and use that wind data to calculate the energy produced on a standardized kilowatt basis. So here, for example, if you take somewhere windy in Ireland like Dingle and Kerry, you'll get this kind of a profile for wind. Yes, it's pretty random. You'll see maybe there's kind of some agglomerations on a seasonal basis. And then you reorder that, as I did with wind, so that you stack it to see what the worst days of the year are. And that will allow us to define the capacity of wind we need if we're not going to rely on any gas. So as we did with solar, we'll have to design for this terrible design point down here where there's hardly any wind being used at all. And if we plug that in to the model, I'll just do it quickly. So I'll go up here. Let's pick my location. So I'll put in Dingle, Kerry, and let's check the settings. So the battery cost, I'm not going to change anything for solar. The wind costs 1,300, 12 hours of storage. The gas I'm going to put back to European prices, so $12 per MMBTU. It is relevant for the open cycle turbine that's used to top up, although that's not the first analysis we're doing. And the cutoff day here is going to be 0 because we're interested in that case where we're only going to use wind. And so when I analyze that, we should see, a really high cost of wind. Does that match? It does. So yeah, this is going to be really high. And as I mentioned, this is probably not even possible because without gas, we're solely relying on that 12 hours of battery. And that's probably not going to get you through a lot of periods of low wind at all. So this is ridiculously expensive and probably not even feasible. However, if you start to add in a little bit of gas, which again we can do by allowing for gas on 50 days of the year, we're able to get that price down significantly. So quite simply, I'll go to the settings, I'll change my cutoff so that I allow for 50 days of gas. And when I analyze that, we should see that the cost of gas comes down. Sorry, the cost of electricity comes down. So it looks like here we're at 38 cents per kilowatt hour with 7% of the electricity here coming from gas. So not really using much gas, but it's still a pretty hefty price of electricity when we're looking at only the 50 worst days. Here is that graph, and you can see why the price is still so high. It's because the graph of wind here is very flat. And so when you come out to the 50th day, it does improve things by being able to design based on this 50th day, but the ratio of the mean power somewhere up here to this 50th day cutoff is still very high. And so we need to massively overbuild the wind plant. You can see that here. We're building 24 gigawatts of wind for every gigawatt that we need to sustain to the data center. And we do have a gigawatt as well of the open cycle gas turbine. Just so you can see, the wind is pretty good in Kerry. It's about 8 meters per second. That's the average across the year. It's about 4, I think, in Dublin. So very significantly better. And Dublin is, maybe it's a little higher than 4 in Dublin. But Dublin is not even that bad because we're, well, not good if you're from the standpoint of not liking windy days. And so that brings us to the gas edition. You can increase that further up to allowing half a year. So on half the year, you allow for gas. And this will bring you down now to a much better price point. So if we analyze it, we can run that analysis quickly. Let's change the cutoff to allow for gas on roughly half of the worst days of the year. And we'll find that now the prices are coming down significantly because we're not having to overbuild the wind. So we're at 14 cents per kilowatt hour. And we're only building 4 gigawatts now for every 1 gigawatt. And our wind curtailment is about 50%. So we're throwing away about half of the energy that is generated by the wind turbines. But that's a lot lower that we're throwing away than if we try to force much less gas on the system. So to recap for wind, wind is better away from the equator. There's not so much wind towards the equator, although sun is good there. And so when you're away from the equator, there are 2 types of storage issue you run into. The first one is these days up to even weeks where you've got low wind, and you need to be able to account for that somehow, if not with gas, with storage. And then the seasonal variation is also fairly strong. Being far away from the equator, you have periods of the year with quite a bit of wind and periods with less. And this forces you to either significantly overbuild capacity and curtail the wind because you've built too much, or to just use more gas, as I demonstrated here in this example. So we'll move on now to the last example, which is solar plus wind. And the idea here is, well, if you combine both solar and wind and gas, are you going to be able to get some kind of a benefit? And we can actually just look directly at that last analysis we ran, which was for a cutoff setting of half of the year. So I've got 183 days. And I don't need to change anything else because I've run that already for Kerry. And we can just check out the summary here. And what you'll see is that when we are using quite a bit of gas, like roughly 30% of our energy generated from gas, we're allowing gas to be used on half of the year. The hybrid system here is not providing a huge amount of benefit over just doing wind plus gas alone. And we can see that more clearly in the hybrid tab. If you scroll down, let's look first here at how the levelized cost varies with the solar fraction. So this is how much solar we use relative to wind, going from 0 to 1. And basically at 0, which is pure wind, we've pretty much got the same cost system as we add in solar. It doesn't really drop. It does increase if we do pure solar. So it would be more expensive to do a pure solar system in Kerry if we are making this assumption around gas. So the hybridization here doesn't provide so much of a benefit. And the reason is, to understand this, you can take a look here at a graph combining. So in red, solar stacked with wind, and then gas filling in on those worst days, corresponding to the worst half days of the year, worst days of the half of the year. And you can see the slope of the graph here. This slope here is actually fairly similar to the slope that we see if we look at the pure wind analysis. So basically in the wind analysis, if we're allowing for gas in the worst 183 days, we're already getting up to a reasonable point here on the cutoff where we're not too far from the mean power that's available from the wind. And so we're not having to overbuild by too much by the time we get to allowing gas on 183 days. By contrast, if we only allow 50 days, there's a very big difference between this cutoff and the mean power that's available. So we end up overbuilding the wind by a very large amount. So basically, if we have the gas flexibility, it's able to fill in when the wind is not around. And if we allow for a lot of gas up to half of the year, we don't get a huge amount of benefit by adding in solar. By contrast, let's just quickly run here and it'll become more clear. If we run the example where we only allow for 50 days of gas at most, this is going to start to look different. So we'll see, first of all, in the wind analysis that down here we're at a shallow part of the curve. The ratio between the median energy or the mean energy produced by the wind turbines is very high relative to the amount produced at our cutoff point. And so just adding in solar here, what it serves to do is basically improve the slope of this curve here. If we go to the hybrid system. So we've improved the slope here just because there's kind of a difference in correlation between solar and wind. So the solar on some of the bad days is not blowing. The solar is shining when the wind is not blowing, and the wind is blowing when the sun is not shining. And this is beneficial because it means that when one is not there, the other is there to some degree. And that means we don't have to build our systems quite as large because we can rely on one to be there when the other isn't. So basically, when we don't rely on much gas at all, then mixing in the solar turns out to be quite beneficial, at least in this case, for the Kerry scenario. In fact, you get a very significant reduction in the cost of energy if you go to hybrid compared to doing wind and gas. And interestingly, if you look at Kerry and you force very little gas usage, it actually can be beneficial to use pure solar over pure wind. And this also boils down to the shape of the curves. If you look at the solar curve here, you can see maybe it's not great. It's coming a bit steeper up here, but ultimately this is better than if we look at the wind curve. The wind curve here is extremely flat as we go down to the left-hand side. And so in wind, we need to massively overbuild. You can see here we have to build 24 gigawatts for every 1 gigawatt. And keep in mind that a gigawatt of wind is more expensive than a gigawatt of solar by a factor of about 2 to 3. Whereas in solar, if we do pure solar, it looks bigger. We have 42, but because solar is cheaper on a per kilowatt basis by a factor of 2 to 3, actually this will require us to build less solar in terms of cost than we would have to with wind. To recap then on the hybrid systems, it makes the most sense to have both solar and wind if the gas is very limited. So if you have some regulatory constraint that you can only use 5% or 10% of your energy coming from gas, then it can make a lot of sense to start adding in solar, at least in a geography like Ireland. If you have a geography where there's just a lot of sun, you might find that it still makes sense to focus on sun. On the other hand, wind or solar alone, so just focusing on one, is good, just as good as hybrid if the gas can be used. So if you have the ability to use gas up to half of the year, then it'll probably be just as good to use wind on its own or solar on its own, depending on which geography you're in. And that brings us to a summary of the entire presentation, because we've come through the modeling of each of these scenarios. Of course, these are specific numbers and cases I've run through, but you can just adjust these to whichever values you feel are appropriate for the project or the analysis you want to do. My main conclusions here: near the equator, solar and battery it's possible to use less than 5% or maybe 10% gas and achieve very good prices. As you move away from the equator, you're probably looking more towards using wind and batteries and allowing for the use of gas on a larger proportion of the days to get to costs that are not too bad. If you really want to get down towards only using gas on, say, 50 days per year, probably there's a benefit to adding in solar as well, because there are some days where the sun is shining and the wind isn't blowing, and that kind of anti-correlation or lack of correlation between the two rather allows you to oversize your system a bit less than you would otherwise. Now, because you're away from the equator, the prices you're getting overall for the renewable systems, because you have to overbuild your system, are not the cheapest. And probably, according to the analyses I've run here, I'm only getting competitive with gas with a wind and battery system at around $25 per MMBTU. And keep in mind, in Europe, gas is right now around $12 per MMBTU, although it has gone up as far as $40 over the last few years. And in the US, gas is only about $2 to $3 per MMBTU. So there's still quite a bit of a way to go to get competitive with gas in the US, or to get competitive with solar plus battery near the equator. In terms of implications, if you're building a data center, well, you might try and build more towards the equator. But of course, there's a trade-off between then building cables and having low latency in the information that's traveling from the data center to the people that you need to serve. If you're a country further from the equator, maybe you're at risk of losing data center infrastructure without a plan that can compete on cost with natural gas and or equatorial sun or near equatorial sun. On the other hand, data centers are pretty high value. It's valuable for them to be close to their customers, and the costs of the GPUs are a lot higher than the cost of any energy infrastructure. So perhaps there's a strong argument that data centers will just have to develop even if the energy cost is high. With respect to path ahead, it was interesting to me looking through some of the work by Austin Vernon, which you can check out here, that now a lot of the cost of solar is not just the panel. If you take even the low figure I gave of 550, maybe only out of that 120 is going to be the panel itself, although there could be some taxes on that in the US. So much of the cost now, it's getting down to soft costs rather than the hard panel costs. And to some degree, this is the case with batteries as well. The price of the battery itself has fallen. So now we're looking at kind of project planning and surrounding softer costs. And probably these are going to be harder to reduce at the same pace that we've seen the reduction in the solar panels and batteries by themselves. With respect to wind, I'm not sure how much more the turbines could fall in price. I suppose it's possible. Planning and environmental reviews are a key factor, and access to land. But turbines are still a significant portion of the total cost price, and maybe there's room for reduction there. In terms of storage, cheaper 1 day to 14-day storage would certainly help wind because of those periods of a few days where there may not be any. And possibly even batteries will go down further in price and allow us to use those for those longer types of duration. Although, as I mentioned above, there are a lot of soft costs involved in batteries. And if those soft costs remain where they are, they would be quite expensive to use as a form of storage, even for a period of something like 10 days. Last of all, seasonality is a big factor for those who are not close to the equator. This means you have to massively overbuild your systems, which forces you to either use quite a bit of gas or to find ways, just be happy with paying a lot more money to overbuild the system. Natural gas is the cheapest form of seasonal storage by quite a bit at the moment. And until that changes, that remains a big disadvantage for countries that are further from the equator, building either wind, which tends to anyway be available only far away from the equator, or solar. And that's my quick overview of the options for powering a gigawatt data center. Let me know if you have any comments below. I'll put a link to the website where you can run your own analyses. I'll also put a link to the GitHub. If you find any errors and want to report them, you can just create an issue right there. Let me know what you thought of this video for the current subscribers used to the language models, whether you found it interesting or it provoked some questions, or if you're new to the channel, welcome, and I hope you enjoy some of the other videos too. Cheers.